Jesus had been killed. He had died on the cross, and he had been buried in a tomb. His disciples were left without their leader and without their friend. They were scared, and they had locked the doors of the room they were in, afraid that they might be arrested. But strange things were happening. You see, 3 days after Jesus had died, people had gone to the tomb and had found it empty. And just earlier on, 2 men had been walking along the road to a village called Emmaus, and Jesus had appeared to them. Could this really be happening? While the disciples were still talking to each other in the locked room, Jesus himself stood in amongst them and said, "Peace be with you." The disciples could not believe their eyes. Shocked, amazed, confused, surprised, delighted, all of these feelings at once. Jesus said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do you have doubts? Look at my hands, and look at my feet. It really is me. Touch and see." Jesus showed them the scars on his hands and feet from where he had been nailed to the cross. The disciples were full of joy and full of amazement. "Do you have anything here to eat?" Jesus asked. They gave him food, and Jesus ate it there in front of them as they all watched. Then Jesus started explaining to them that it was always God's plan that the Messiah, the promised rescuer, would suffer death, but then rise from the dead on the third day. Jesus explained that thanks to what had happened, thanks to the fact that he had died on the cross and then been buried, and thanks to the fact that 3 days later he had risen from the dead and come back to life, people could turn to God and have their sins forgiven. "You know this," Jesus said to his friends. And just like that, Jesus disappeared from their sight. Now one of Jesus' disciples, Thomas, had been missing. When the other disciples told him, "We've seen Jesus, he's alive, he was here," Thomas did not believe them. "Unless I see and touch the nail marks in his hands and feet, I will not believe," Thomas said. A week later, Jesus' disciples were in the house again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were all locked. Then, just like he had the week before, Jesus appeared and said, "Peace be with you." Then he turned to Thomas. Jesus said, "Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. See my feet. See my side. See the scars. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas replied, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told Thomas, "Thomas, you have believed because you have seen me. How good is it when people believe even when they haven't seen me?" So, what does this story show us about Jesus? It shows us that he's alive. Jesus died. 3 days later, he rose from the dead, came back to life. And after that, he appeared, he showed himself to people as proof, as evidence that he was alive. And he's still alive today. He's gone back to heaven now. He's sat at his Father's right hand, and he is alive. So what does this event show us about Jesus? It shows us that he's alive. Jesus died on the cross, and 3 days later he rose from the dead. He came back to life. And this story is just one instance where he appeared to people, where people saw Jesus alive after he'd been put to death. So the proof is there that Jesus is alive. He's not dead anymore. He's gone back to heaven now, and he is living, sat there at his Father's right hand. Jesus is alive. In some ways, in a lot of ways, Thomas's reaction up until the point where Jesus appeared to him wasn't good. It's kind of understandable. This was a big thing to believe, that Jesus had come back from the dead. Thomas should have believed, because Jesus had told his disciples that this was going to happen. He had told his disciples that he would die. He had told his disciples that he would rise again from the dead. Thomas was one of those disciples. He was one of Jesus' close friends. So Thomas didn't trust fully what Jesus had told them was going to happen. But it is quite a big thing to believe. If I were to say to you that a person who we knew was dead had come back to life, you'd have trouble believing that. It's a huge thing to believe. The reason why Thomas should have believed is because it was Jesus who said it. And if up to that point he had fully understood who Jesus was, then he would have believed it. You wouldn't believe it if I said it. You wouldn't believe it if anybody else said it, because it would be unbelievable. But because of who Jesus is, Thomas should have believed what Jesus said. And Thomas had seen the things that Jesus had done, had seen all of the miracles, heard all of the things that he'd said. And that's why Jesus says to Thomas at the end of the story, there are other people who haven't seen and they believe. You've seen and you didn't believe. But even though Thomas doubted, when Jesus showed himself to Thomas, Thomas's reaction was a good one, a very, very good one. Even though up until then, he hadn't put his trust in what Jesus had said. He hadn't fully grasped who Jesus was, because if he had fully grasped who Jesus was, he would have believed that he would follow through on what he'd said. He would believe that he would come back from the dead like he'd said he would. But even though up until this moment he's doubted, when Thomas sees Jesus, the Bible tells us that he says, "My Lord and my God." And just in those words, you can see that finally Thomas has got it. Thomas now understands that Jesus is Lord and Jesus is God. And in Thomas's words there, it's clear that Thomas's view of Jesus is now what it should be. And Thomas's understanding of Jesus is now what it should be. He understands that everything Jesus said would happen has happened. And he's confirming that he now grasps and understands just who Jesus is and just how wonderful he is. The question for you and for me is, have we grasped who Jesus is? Do we understand that Jesus is Lord and Jesus is God? Do we understand those things? If we do understand them, and if we put our trust in those things as being true, then Jesus can be my Lord and my God. Like Thomas said there, that can be true of you. You could say Jesus is my Lord and my God, if we believe in him.